this evening to introduce our guest speaker.
Did you want me to talk now, Joan?
No, I was, I guess that was the part where I was, oh, I see we're recording already. I was supposed to count to 5, but I didn't. Okay, so yeah, okay, I'm sorry. So now, so moving right along, I've known Sarah for a long time. We go back about 30 years now. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce her this evening. She served as president of WNPS from 95 to 96. She managed the University of Washington Herbarium for 13 years, co-authoring a centenary survey of plant life in Washington state and participating in the International Kuril Island Project. For the latter half of her career, she worked on biodiversity conservation and salmon recovery at the Recreation and Conservation Office in Olympia. She has curated the Botanical Rambles blog for WNPS. Many of you are probably familiar with that blog, which began in 2012. And she currently serves on a number of state board committees, the Communications Committee, the Editorial Board for Douglasia, the Financial Advisory Committee, and the Fundraising Committee. So Sarah's staying very involved, and tonight she is going to take us on a little segue over to the British Isles to look at some Pacific Northwest plants that have somehow crossed the ocean. Sarah.
Thank you.
Oh, so, one more thing.
Oh yeah.
If you, questions can go into chat or into the question and answer, and at the end I'll be helping field those questions out of there and running pass interference. Okay, I'm done now, Sarah.
Okay, thanks, Joan.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna click this and then this, and they should all be seeing my screen now. So I want to thank you again, Joan, for that introduction. And as mentioned, my name is Sarah Gage. I'm speaking to you tonight from my home in Seattle. And I want to acknowledge that my home sits on the unceded ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, who were the first people of Seattle. And I honor with gratitude the land itself, the Duwamish people, and the other Coast Salish peoples of this region, both past and present. So before we get started, I have a couple of questions that we're going to sprinkle through the presentation. So if Denise, if you're listening, if you could put up the first question. So this is a simple yes or no. And I'm just wondering if you've been to the United Kingdom or Great Britain or England, Scotland, Ireland, anything like that. Northern Ireland actually is part of the United Kingdom. So if you could just fill out this yes or no answer and let us know. Oh, I guess I have to answer it too. There we go. And then let's see, Denise, will you be showing the answers? Here we go. So we have a preponderance of us who have been to the United Kingdom. And so I'm guessing I now know the answer to question number 2, but let's go ahead and do number 2 as well. Let's do the second question, second poll, Denise, if you get a chance. So if you've been to Great Britain, you've probably been to London. I know I have. So just click on that. And so just a few of you have been to the Great Britain without going to London. So I'm not surprised at that at all. So thank you for doing that. We'll have a few more questions throughout. So with respect to questions, I'm just going to soldier on through the presentation tonight. And I hope to take your questions at the end. And you can feel free to type your questions. We've got a couple of options. There's the Q&A box or the chat. I believe both are options for you. There is also sometimes a little hand that you could raise, and that means that you want to say out loud your question, which gets you unmuted. And we'll do all of those questions at the end, whatever format you choose. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about some plants, gardens, and places, people, customs I've observed during several trips to Great Britain. Most recently, I was there in the before times in 2019. In particular, I'm going to talk about Northwest native plants in Great Britain, some ornamentals and some invasives. I'm going to talk about plants that are native to Great Britain that we have as invasives here in Washington, and plants that are troublesome from somewhere else that are both troublesome both here and in Great Britain. And along the way, I'll show you a couple sites, both horticultural and culinary. So I, for one, am having a cup of tea. Let's see if I can get this to go. There we go. So no scones, but I've got a cup of tea. And so let's get started. I want to first, let's see, I'm going to disappear. Let's see, how do I do that? Stop my video. And that's to conserve bandwidth. I have an unstable, slightly unstable connection thanks to CenturyLink. So if I don't share, then we have a better chance of all staying connected through the evening. So next slide. So I wanted to just point out that these are the British Isles. This large island here is the island of Great Britain, and it includes England, Wales, and Scotland. And the United Kingdom are these three countries and Northern Ireland. So that's what makes up the United Kingdom. When you hear about people talking about the UK, that's what they're talking about. Great Britain is the island, and the British Isles are all of these islands. So in terms of size, Great Britain is slightly more than 80,000 square miles. Now, Washington State is about 71,000 square miles, and Oregon is 98,000 square miles. So Great Britain is between Washington and Oregon in size. In terms of population, Washington, last time I checked, was 7.6 million. Oregon was 4.2 million, whereas Great Britain has 61 million people. So that's a lot of people in an area that's smaller than Oregon. And just for context, the US population of the whole country is approaching 332 million. So some differences there. But still, Britain has a reputation and the popular image of this green and pleasant land. And part of that has to do with their zoning and agricultural laws that people have to make a living if they live on agricultural land. They have to make some of their income from actual farming. So that tends to keep land in farming. And then also, I believe they have different kinds of zoning so that when you leave a town, you go into the countryside, unlike, say, here in the United States, where you leave a town and the only reason you know that you're getting to a different town is because you are seeing yet again the same sequence of franchises. So you start running into the same franchises again. We have a lot of sprawl here in the United States. And so in some communities, it can be very difficult to tell when you're leaving one and getting into another. And oftentimes in my experience in Britain, it's very clear. You leave a town, you go into the countryside, and then you approach a new town or different town. So I'm going to talk now about the Royal Horticultural Society's Chelsea Flower Show. And so this would be a good time, Denise, for us to do our third and fourth polls. So the third poll will ask you whether you have ever attended the Royal Horticultural Society's Chelsea Flower Show. Normally, if we were in person, I would just ask you to raise your hand, but I'm not seeing that poll, so perhaps we will just move on. Oh, there it is. Have you ever attended the Royal Horticultural Society Chelsea Flower Show? It's a yes from me. I've actually been to it twice, once in 2016 or maybe it was 2017. I think it was 2016. And then again last year or 2 years ago in 2019. Okay, so just a few of you have attended the Royal Horticultural Chelsea Flower Show. And then just for contrast, Denise, if we could do that fourth poll, have you ever attended the Northwest Flower and Garden Show in Seattle? Yeah, so this one. I'm do a little contrast, compare and contrast, you know, which is a favorite of English teachers throughout the world. Not that I'm an English teacher, although I did teach English for a couple of sort of uncomfortable years, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, so about 70% of you have attended the Northwest Flower and Garden Show in Seattle. So that's great. That gives me some context for my remarks. So Britain, as I'm sure you probably are aware, has a very strong gardening tradition and culture. And here, this is a slide of a picture of a London taxi that's been adapted for the Chelsea Garden Show with the sponsor on it, the primary sponsor. And this is known as the premier event of the gardening year, the Royal Horticultural Society's Chelsea Flower Show. And it's held on the grounds of, let's see here, held on the grounds of the Royal Chelsea Hospital, which is Royal Hospital Chelsea, which is an elegant military retirement home. It houses about 300 veterans. And this building was designed by Sir Christopher Wren in 1682. And this picture is from my visit to the Chelsea Flower Show in 2016, when they were doing a red poppy memorial for veterans. And as you may know, after the Great War, as they called it, World War I, the red poppy from Flanders Fields became a symbol for veterans in the UK and other parts of Europe as well. And just to do a quick comparison between the Chelsea Garden Show, Chelsea Flower Show, and the Northwest Flower and Garden Show. So they're both 5 days long. Chelsea is in May, and Northwest Show is in February, which is certainly when we tend to need a little input of spring-like stuff here in the Northwest. But the advantage for Chelsea is that then they hold theirs outdoors. So even though the weather can be iffy sometimes, you get really some glorious opportunities for looking at great looking plants. Significantly more visitors to Chelsea than to the Northwest Flower and Garden Show, 169,000 in 2019. And the gardeners themselves have much longer to build their show gardens at Chelsea than they do in Seattle, 19 days versus 13 days. And the gardens are almost twice as big at Chelsea, the show gardens. So they have 2,800 square feet compared to up to 1,500 square feet. And some of them in Seattle are much, much smaller. The entire show area in Chelsea is much larger, also about 11 acres. And as I mentioned, the Chelsea show is at least partly outside. They both have about the same number of exhibitors, about 320 or so at both shows. And one big difference is that a very popular feature of the Northwest Flower and Garden Show is that they offer somewhere in the order of 100 seminars, whereas Chelsea, they don't offer any seminars at all. There are entertainment, like music and a lot of really great restaurants and other food venues, but not seminars on gardening. And just to further orient you, this is an aerial view of the Chelsea district in London. So here's the River Thames going along the south, the bottom of the slide, and the Royal Hospital Chelsea is here, and the grounds spread over this entire area. and that's where the show is. And this, I don't believe, was from the garden show, the flower show, but they'll have a big tent, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So Chelsea is both a district in London. When you say I exhibited at Chelsea, you're talking about the Chelsea Flower Show. And then in a little bit, I'll talk about the Chelsea Physic Garden, which is an ancient garden. Well, not ancient, it's from the Enlightenment, but it's here in just down the river from the hospital. So when I talk about show gardens, I'll just read you from the creative brief. A show garden demonstrates the best of horticulture and excellence in garden design and innovative landscaping. The largest gardens at the show offer the ability to create the extraordinary, generate wonder and excitement, and make a lasting impact at the world's most prestigious flower show. So here's a selection of gardens from 2019. As you can imagine, the show was canceled last year in 2020, and this year, 2021, they have, for the first time ever, moved it from May to September. So they're hoping to be able to have the show in September this year. So this garden in 2019 was the Finnish garden, and I'll quote again, designed for an urban garden in the center of Helsinki, this outdoor space offers its owners a space to sit and relax with planting that echoes the countryside and landscape of rural Finland. The planting is multi-layered and rich in meadow plants. The national flower, lily of the valley, features alongside the rare mutation red birch and the slow-growing juniper, rich in scent and flavor and a significant ingredient in the serving of gin. Oops. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Let's see. Here we go. So this is the Montessori Garden from 2019, a stimulating and child-focused space that takes color, texture, interest, and learning to a new level of adventure and excitement, while putting children at the heart of being outdoors. And this clearly was very bright. They've repurposed a storage, a shipping container here. I was a little surprised to see a flat screen TV in this children-oriented garden, but maybe that's just reality. This is the Facebook garden from 2019. Quote, a coastal design theme celebrates communities coming together through the use of social media, and with water and the ocean used as the elements that link all our nations. And they had a clever little thing here that created sort of a lapping wave type motion in this show garden. And then the second to last one we'll look at is this Welcome to Yorkshire garden, where they reconstructed a lock and a bridge and a lock keeper's cabin. And here's what the brief on this one says. Pollarded willow, so willow that's been pruned, and wild planting that includes cow parsley, digitalis, and teasels surround a central lock and towpath, complete with an authentic lock keeper's cottage and garden. This year, or 2019, marked designer Mark Gregory's 99th Chelsea garden. So either he's incredibly ancient or he's been putting in more than one garden per year. His replica of a West Yorkshire canal and lock tender's cottage required the efforts of 60 workers with cranes and hydraulics. So Mark Gregory himself said that the show highlights something we're still good at, which is growing plants. He said, we were once a great industrial powerhouse, but now not so much, I would say. But at horticulture, we're hard to beat. He went on to say that plants for gardens and vases outpace edible crops in Britain in gross domestic product. And the secret, he said, was that they have a great climate, even though they have crap weather. So the final garden I'm going to share with you from Chelsea in 2019 is the so-called Back to Nature Garden. And this woodland-inspired space included plenty of opportunities for exploring from this huge nest-like tree house. There's a fallen tree in here, which I don't think we can see, that has places to crawl through. There's a swing, and even a little place to build a little campfire and have a cookout. So this garden was famous for the involvement of the Duchess of Cambridge, Kate Middleton, who helped design this garden. And she and Prince William and their children visited the garden on Press Day, which is the Monday of the week, along with the Queen. And it was in this garden that we get our first glimpse of a plant native to Washington at Chelsea during this visit. So you'll see here our deer fern, which used to be called Blechnum spicant, but I understand has been moved to the genus Struthiopteris. And this is actually a circumboreal fern, meaning that it grows all around the North Temperate area. So it's native also to Britain. So if we're ready now to move on to the Great Pavilion, we can fortify ourselves with a bit more tea and a few more scones. So the Great Pavilion is this huge tent, and it covers 3 acres. And inside are more than 80 exhibitors, growers, nurseries, designers, and floristry displays. And as the publicity says, the Great Pavilion has long been the jewel in Chelsea's crown. And inside the pavilion, you'll find these incredible floral displays. And so I took a couple of panoramic shots. Up here we have daffodils for days, and this is one of clematis. Sometimes the displays are really spectacular. Over here on the left, we have a number of ornamental onions, the genus Allium, shooting up almost like a firework display. In the center are numerous rock garden troughs built in these little, or sometimes not so little, cement or tufa troughs. And these are primarily members of the carnation family, pinks and so forth. And then over here, we have the Himalayan blue poppy, Meconopsis, and a variety of primroses, primula. What I've noticed is that the British are mad for camas. And camas is something that we have here in the Northwest, of course, native, and particularly the great camas, Camassia lineae. And so here it is in 2 exhibits in the Great Pavilion, the blue form and the white form. And these were formerly in the family, the Liliaceae, and I understand that they've now been recategorized in the Asparagaceae. Now, the Royal Horticultural Society, which sponsors the Chelsea Flower Show, has a pretty fascinating website. And so one of the things that they have on this website are numerous, it's a place to examine a lot of different cultivars. So you can see there's 4 different cultivars listed here. There's the species, and then a couple of subspecies, Sexdorfia Maybell, and then Blue Heaven. So they've done a lot of breeding and have a lot of named varieties. We'll see another example of this in a minute for the different group. Other Northwest favorites that you see frequently in the flower show are our local bleeding heart, Dicentra formosa, which has also undergone a lot of breeding, both here and in Great Britain. So different color morphs. This is quite dark pink compared to the light pink that I have growing in my garden. And then our fringe cup, Thelema grandiflora, is used as a lot of that sort of nice yellow-green filler in the show gardens. I think it produces well for them, and they can use it in a lot of different circumstances. Our red flowering currant is a big favorite there too, and it was first introduced to British horticulture by David Douglas back in the 1830s. And they have 40 cultivars listed on the Royal Horticultural Society website. So all these wonderful names: white icicle, broccolbanki, Tideman's white, red pimpernel, Pokey's pink, Koja, King Edward VII, red bross, Pulborough scarlet. I'm sure there's stories behind all of these. I have this white icicle given to me years ago, but cuttings by the late Dr. Eugene Kozloff, and it's very lovely in my garden, very dependable, and it's coming into flower right as we speak. If you're ready for some more fortification, I have to recommend the lemon drizzle. These look like cupcakes, but they're actually much more satisfying, much more substantial. And if you've watched the Great British Baking Show, you know that lemon drizzle is something that the British do very well. They have the whole lemon drizzle thing down. Highly recommended. Another real contrast at RHS Chelsea is the amount of media attention it gets. I mean, just to start with, the BBC through the growing season has a weekly Gardener's World program every Friday, which usually runs an hour, sometimes 2 hours. And then during Chelsea Week, there's increased coverage. They have nightly primetime programs, an hour-long program every night. And they have numerous personalities. Some of the more famous ones are Monty Don, Joe Swift, and Sophie Raworth. And that's just a few of the media personalities. So when I was there in 2016, Monty Don, who's seen on the left in the picture on the right, is interviewing a garden designer named Rosie Hardy, and I was, able to sort of eavesdrop. The crowds, of course, are kept back by these sort of velvet ropes made out of twine. And here's a staffer who's getting them all set up for the camera. So it's just fascinating to see horticulture reach such media heights. Now, if I had thought about it, I guess I had assumed that when I went to Chelsea, I would see, sort of my stereotype of sort of the British eccentric person. So someone maybe wearing tweeds and a cap, Macintosh or a rain hat, maybe sort of looking a little bit like Miss Marple from the Agatha Christie mysteries. But what I found actually was that there was quite a Chelsea look, at least in the years that I went. So for women, it was straw hats and scarves and a tote bag, some stylish but comfortable shoes, and then ample bags for shopping. And then the men were wearing sports coats and khakis, some really styling suits. We get a little bit of the floral motif. And then on the far right, you have a Chelsea pensioner wearing the trademark Chelsea pensioner's red coat. Now, should you think that Chelsea is just about the show, the surrounding area, notably Sloane Square, gets all dolled up with displays. And in 2019, the theme was the world's oceans. So here's a little boutique. There's lots of boutiques and very fancy stores around Sloane Square. And Princess Diana was famously a Sloane Ranger, that is a young society woman who lived near Sloane Square back in the day. And so here's a boutique all decorated for Chelsea Week. And if we get closer in on one of these fish, you can see that it's constructed from none other than the leaves of our very own salal, Gaultheria chalon. And once I started seeing that, I started seeing it everywhere. So here we've got salal leaves being made into some kind of huge bud or artichoke, I'm not quite sure, on the left. And then on the right, these are representative of bees in an apiary exhibit. So the salal leaves are representing the wings of the bees. A couple of other of those window displays. On the left, we see branches of our Western red cedar forming the fins of this fish that is artfully displaying a loafer. And then on the right, not quite sure what this had to do with the oceans, but it's a nice exhibit of one of our horsetails, Equisetum hyamale, which is fronting for, I believe it was a leather goods store. The year of the ocean, it was kind of poignant that year. That was the year that the J-pod lost one of its calves in Puget Sound. And so it was poignant to see this construction of an orca in London. And it was in fact made of plants. These are aspidistra leaves. You may be familiar with that houseplant. And this is a close-up so you can see how it was constructed in some way from all those different leaves. All around Sloane Square, needless to say, there are tea rooms if you need more fortification, with some homemade cakes, fragrant teas, and freshly made sandwiches that are available all day. Ample opportunities to get your strength up. Now, I visited an assortment of public gardens while I was during my various trips to the UK. The first botanic garden that was founded in the UK was the Oxford Botanic Garden, established in 1621. Chelsea Physic Garden followed in 1673, and it's, as I mentioned, just down the road from the Royal Hospital at Chelsea. The Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh was formed in 1670. I don't have a logo for Kew. I haven't actually been to Kew since the mid-90s. But Kew Gardens, very famous and justly so, was established in 1759. And then the Royal Horticulture Society's own garden at Wisley, and they have several partner gardens at this time, but Wisley was formed in 1878. I'm going to switch gears slightly here with this heavy plant crossing. So I was very amused at the thought that in Chelsea they were getting so into the construction that they had to have a special traffic sign for heavy plants growing across the road. Well, it turned out that this is actually a sign. Heavy plant means heavy construction equipment, trucks, and so forth. So like truck entering roadway, that kind of thing. But it also means that I'm going to get a little heavy right now and talk about some of the history, the less savory aspects of gardening and horticulture and how these plants have come into cultivation. So when I visited the Chelsea Physic Garden, excuse me, I came across this statue of Hans Sloane. And as you probably are aware, plant collecting and scientific exploration, they're part of that culture of imperialism, colonialism, and really some very brutal class divides and natural resource exploitation. So Hans Sloane was very much a man of his time. He was a physician, a naturalist, a collector, and his collections formed the basis of the British Museum, the British Library, and the Natural History Museum in London. And so it was on his land that the Chelsea Physic Garden was formed. And he leases the garden to the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries for just £5 a year in perpetuity. And I believe, from what I understand from the tour that I took at the Chelsea Physic Garden, that this £5 or £5 rent is still paid every year. He went as a physician to Jamaica, and he wrote this treatise, which you'll see in the center of the slide, on his discoveries there. Discoveries, I say in quotes. And one of the things that he brought back was quinine, which eventually became useful in the treatment of malaria. And it was also in Jamaica that Sloane observed that the local women in Jamaica were mixing cocoa with milk and using it to treat stomach ailments. And he found this fascinating and brought back the recipe with him. And what I learned was that the recipe would eventually be sold or bought by Cadbury's of the Cadbury English. Cadbury's is an English type of chocolate, and would help Sloane on his way to becoming very wealthy. And while he was in Jamaica, he chronicled the really hideous punishments inflicted on enslaved peoples in the West Indies. And so we're not able to say that he wasn't aware of what was going on. And it was interesting, I was reading up on him just a little bit before starting this talk, and it turns out that in April of 2020, so just this past year, in the aftermath of, well, the British Museum was putting together sort of a decolonizing its collections exhibit. And so they moved his statue into an exhibit so that they could call attention both to the beneficial things that he did for the museum, but also his very troubling history and role in Jamaica and elsewhere. And then a little closer to home, this is a picture I took in the National Portrait Gallery, and this is Peter Rainier, who Mount Rainier was named for by George Vancouver, taking away the indigenous name of Tahoma. And so Vancouver was very much part of that explorative, imperialistic endeavor. This is another sign that was at the Chelsea Physic Garden, and how cotton plants from the Chelsea Physic Garden that had been brought there were introduced to Georgia, the state of Georgia here in the United States. So just reading this to you, Oglethorpe, founder of the Georgia Project, insisted that the trustees ban rum and slavery. Well, clearly that didn't last long. Although the Gossypium hirsutum, that's the scientific name for cotton, sent from Chelsea was suitable for cultivation in Georgia, it was not economically successful in the early days. Cotton is very labor intensive, not only to grow, but also to harvest and gin, the process used to separate the seed from the hairs. It takes, for instance, 2 days of picking, 50 of ginning, and 20 to clean in order to produce 8 pounds of spinnable cotton. Cheap labor in the form of slaves was crucial to the cop's economic viability. And even then, it was not until Eli Whitney invented the first mechanical cotton gin in 1793 that mass production really took off. So when you delve a little bit into the history of, say, cotton, sugar, tobacco, coffee, tea, spices, chocolate, rubber, the list goes on, there's been an incredible human and ecological toll. And it's still very much shaping our lives today. While all that exploration and exchange of biological goods, has brought us many wonderful things, coffee and chocolate, for example, that has this very bitter and destructive legacy. And I think it's very important that when we're enjoying these gardens and these plants, that we remember there's this other part of the story as well, and to keep that in mind as we explore and we learn. So, for example, I'm now at the Royal Horticultural Society Wisley Garden, which I have to recommend is just a wonderful garden. I was so impressed both with the displays that they had and the experiments that they're doing, and it's botanically interesting. So often you go to a garden that has wonderful displays, but botanically it's sort of meh, but this one really, really knocked my socks off. But so I was very sorry to have missed this enormous display. All of this underneath these trees is grape camas, Camassia leichtlinii. And I bet it is just really something when it's in flower. Here's a close-up. You can see they're going to seed, and here's the sign. This is Camassia leichtlinii subspecies Sextorphia in the Cerulean group. So I was really sorry I had missed the display, and this is so typical, right? Anybody comes to your garden, you should say, oh, you should have been here last week, or, oh, next week it's going to be great. So it's always a jam yesterday and jam tomorrow kind of situation. But so it was just interesting to me that I could imagine what it must be like for someone for whom camas is a vital food crop in their tradition. and to come and see this great display of it in a horticultural setting. It's a different sort of experience. Now, our common camas, Camassia quamash, has kept its ties with the indigenous name, Quamash. Camassia Leichlinii, however, has been named in the current scientific tradition for a German horticulturalist, and it was named, so Leichlin was a German horticulturist, and it was named that by a man named Baker, who was a British botanist and horticulturist who was doing a monograph of groups in this subfamily of what was then the Liliaceae. So how these names have been sort of transmuted from a name that might be recognizable to the original users and growers of the plant and brought into the scientific tradition with a name that is quite foreign to its origins. While at Wisley, I visited their alpine house, and I was pleased to see the examples of our native Louisias there. On the left is our bitterroot, Louisia rediviva, named, of course, after another explorer, imperialist, if you will, Meriwether Lewis. And this is a cultivar that's been developed, Jolon alba, so it has the white flowers, whereas typically our bitterroot is pink. In the middle is Louisia columbiana, the Columbia Louisia, and on the right is Louisia Tweediai, now known as Louisiopsis Tweediai. And I have to say that their specimen didn't look so great when I was visiting. Hopefully it will perk up. And these are all now, they're labeled here as being in the Portulacaceae, which is what they were in the first edition of our Flora of the Pacific Northwest, and they have since been reclassified and considered now to be part of the Montiaceae. Two more plants that I saw at Wisley were Salvia Dorian, which is familiar to you over there on the east side, and the gray ball sage is its common name. And then Cornus canadensis, or bunchberry, always a favorite to see. And our typical one on the west side here, I believe, is still called Cornus unalashkensis, but Cornus canadensis, I believe, is in the northeast part of Washington. Also saw a couple of onions. Here is the taper tip, or hooker's onion, Allium acuminatum, which has those acuminate tips. It's a good way of remembering its specific epithet. And then on the right is Allium cernuum, the nodding onion. And I was sort of bemused to see that their sample really isn't very nodding. In my garden, the inflorescences stay nodding even when they're in full bloom. So both of these now, they had them classified in the Alliaceae, the Allium family. In our current version of the flora, they're now considered part of the Amaryllidaceae. Of course, they were formerly part of the Liliaceae as well. Finally, I wanted to show you some British, oops, going the wrong way. Wanted to show you some British native plants that they had in the gardens, and perhaps you might be able to recognize them. Take a sip of my tea there. So I don't know if this plant on the left is a problem for you over on the east side. It's been scrubbed out in several places here on the west side. This is garlic mustard, Alliaria petiolata. I understand it makes a good pesto, but the noxious weed folks really don't want this getting established here in Western Washington. The one in the middle, I think you probably are familiar with on the east side of the state. That's where I have seen it. I saw it growing over near Pullman. And this is the so-called Scotch thistle, Onoportum acanthium. It's a very handsome plant, but pretty miserable to have in rangeland, and not, again, something that people don't want this to get established in any major way. And then something that we deal with a lot here in the west side This is Herb Robert, Geranium robertianum. And if you've ever weeded it or pulled it out of your garden, you know why it also has the common name Stinky Bob. It's a very foul odor. But this is a beloved member of many British hedgerows, as is the garlic mustard. So in the countryside, you'll frequently see these growing freely and having their place in the ecology of those systems. All this talk of weeds and weeding has made me hungry. So now, enough of the scones. We'll have a few meat pies before we get going on our next part of our journey. I've been lucky enough to go on a couple of walking trips in Great Britain. So in addition to being a country of gardeners, walking is another part of the British identity, and walking routes, which are not necessarily trails, going throughout the countryside with traditional rights of way going through private property. Very different from the kind of response you would get around here in many cases if you were to take a right of way through private property. There's very detailed maps available for the whole country and many signposted routes. So in the left, you see me, I'm bringing up the rear naturally, on the coast-to-coast route across the north part of England. And here I am with my partner, Shelley. We're doing just a very, very short part of the Hadrian's Wall path. And you can see there's all sorts of different signposts. The acorn has a specific meaning, which I'm forgetting at the moment. And in most cases, the paths are very well signposted. Although in some cases, you're not exactly sure what it is that they are trying to tell you. So which direction do we go? Along these walks, you'll sometimes see iconic wildlife. Now, I was amused that like in Washington, you're much more likely to see salmon art than you are to see an actual salmon, unless you are going out specifically looking for one. And similarly, I kept seeing red squirrel art. So here on a bench, here's another bench, here's a statue that was in somebody's window. And it was only in a reserve that I actually saw a red squirrel. They have been displaced in much of the country by the North American eastern gray squirrel, which of course is the squirrel that I have in my yard in Seattle as well. Livestock is another fun thing to watch out for. In the upper left is the belted Galloway, which is a type of beef cattle. And then on the lower left, you'll see a type of sheep, the G sheep. There were so many types of sheep that actually I bought a field guide to sheep, which I have to say didn't help all that much, but it was very fascinating to look through. And then throughout Britain, I noticed several types of two-headed animals. Here's a black sheep with two heads and a cattle breed with two heads. Sorry, I couldn't resist. And human pursuits as well. This is a group of school kids doing a maypole dance on a village green in Yorkshire when I was on the coast-to-coast path. And then when we were in Swaledale, we came across some people, actually, no, it was Wensleydale. How could I forget? I went to the cheese factory in honor of Wallace and Gromit. So here we are in Wensleydale, and they actually were just playing cricket, just like people pick up games around here. There are risks, of course, for this kind of travel if you're walking from place to place. And these are my comprehensively bandaged toes. I have since purchased a pair of longer hiking boots. And so I'm relieved to say that I don't need to put quite so many bandages on my toes these days. But I did have this system pretty well down. And there are, of course, rewards. The ubiquitous tea and scones. And there is a raging debate, I understand, as to whether you put the jam on the scone first or the cream. And I'm here to tell you that it's equally delicious whether you put on the cream first or the jam first. And then you may be moved on your walking trip to have a Sound of Music moment. Here I am on the Coast to Coast tour, and I'm just being moved to song, captured by one of my fellow trip mates. And here we are high in the hills of the Lake District. But back to plants. So obviously some of our English problems, like English ivy, come from England or grow in England. And you'll see also the Oxide Daisy. So Heterohelix, English ivy, Leucanthemum vulgare, the Oxide Daisy. These are part of the ecosystem in Great Britain. Similarly, gorse, which is a problem on the Long Beach Peninsula and other places. Here it is in Scotland, growing in a neat, tidy clump. Sometimes, of course, it can cover acres. It's a very prickly plant with flowers like Scots broom, but this is in northern Scotland. And then we have affected a fair number of plant exchanges. So, for example, on the left is a patch of our snowberry, Symphocarpus albus, which grows wild in London and in many sort of waste places throughout the country. It's a real problem for them, and they grub it out when they can. And unfortunately, I didn't get a picture of this, but in the same area, I saw a bed of very carefully tended and clearly a landscaping installation of Scots broom, which, as you know, is a terrible problem in South Puget Sound areas of Washington State, as well as many other places. So it was just sort of this exchange, an inadvertent exchange of weeds. So they have our snowberry and we have their Scots broom, and none of us are happy about it. Another plant that's becoming a real problem for them is our skunk cabbage, Lysichiton americanus, the American skunk cabbage. And this spectacular perennial, it has these enormous paddle-shaped leaves that get to be 1.5 meters tall, and these yellow arum-like flowers with the big yellow spathe and the green spadix. Spreads vigorously in wet woodlands and wetlands and ditches, of which they have many in Great Britain. And so it's forming dense stands and smothering most other plants. And that's certainly something we can relate to, not with our native, but with other plants that have been exchanged. And then, of course, we have problems that are plants that are problems for both of us. So, for example, here is Japanese knotweed, used to be called Polygonum cuspidatum, and is now called Falloppia japonica, I'm sorry to say. But this homeowner found that she was unable to sell her house because the home inspection came back with a very damning report saying that there is an extensive outbreak of Japanese knotweed to the left and rear of gardens of the property, which is uncontrolled. The extensive outbreak renders the property unsuitable for normal lending. In other words, anyone who buys this house that he's trying to sell would not be able to obtain a mortgage because of the uncontrolled knotweed in the adjacent gardens. And the fear or the problem is that it undermines, destroys the foundation of the houses. Another plant that we have that's a problem for both of us is the giant hogweed, Heracleum montagasianum. And it's a big problem, and not just because it's a big plant. It causes a photosensitivity in a lot of people's skin, and rashes and blisters that turn black and just very, very hard on skin. And actually our own Heracleum, the cow parsley, Heracleum linatum, also causes skin sensitivity in some unfortunate people. But it was in the headlines in 2019, and it's been the subject of at least one mystery novel. So, for example, in 2019, there was giant hogweed takeover. Can UK's most dangerous plant be stopped? Bleak outlook. Warning over giant hogweed, which is set to thrive in the coming weeks. It's Britain's most dangerous plant. And the curse of the giant hogweed. I think I used to have that book, but I couldn't find it when I was looking for it recently. Well, with all this bad news, you guessed it, it's time for some more cake. And this one's at a country fete. And with all these cakes, it's true that traveling can be a, shall we say, broadening experience, but also the source of new experiences. So here I am in London, and I am determined to get my shot. So I've climbed up on the railing, and I'm determined, it's the Queen's birthday parade. I'm determined to get my pictures of the royal family. So here are Meghan and Harry in what we can only assume, hope, were happier days. They've been in the press quite a bit most recently. And if there's one thing the British know how to do, it is put on a spectacular display. And then finally, I got my shot of the Queen, or at least the Queen's hat. And this also, as I said, was during her birthday parade. And then this, of course, is followed by the flyover and a 21 cannon salute. So to close up, I want to give a few thanks. My slide, the template was from an organization called Slides Carnival with plant illustrations from Köhler's Medicinal Pflanzen. I want to thank my travel companions, Shelley Farber, Elizabeth Gage, and Annie Gage over the years. And that coast-to-coast trip I took was guided by the company Distant Journeys. And so with that, here's a final slice and cuppa, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a delightful journey through the British Isles, and I like the baked goods that were cleverly spaced out between the plants. That was good. But it made me kind of hungry, especially the lemon drizzle. And the most startling thing was that you can actually buy a field guide to sheep. I had no idea. Okay, so I had one comment in the chat, which was Ann Merrill says she's actually seen red squirrels. So there's, and then it looks like I've got a question over here from Howard Baldwin. How do you eradicate a weed when it's on someone else's property?
Stealthily. No. Unfortunately, that's outside of our control, and it's oftentimes it's not the biological organisms that are difficult; it's the human organisms. So, yeah, you have to communicate, and God knows that's hard.
So that raises a question for me. Do they have like a noxious weed control board there, like we do in the?
That's a good question, and I don't really know the answer to that. I'm assuming they do. They seem to have a council for everything. So, yeah, I'm assuming that they do, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, and I was also impressed by the real estate situation with the lady with the Japanese knotweed. I'm not sure that I've ever, of course, I have pretty limited exposure, but I would be interested if real estate people in this country actually, either reduce the value or refuse to sell property that's, I don't know that there's that kind of awareness about noxious weeds in the real estate world.
Yeah. I imagine on agricultural land, it would be brought up quite a bit. I know, I don't have the full story, but I know that there's also a type of hedge, the Leyland cypress hedge, that has been declared in some cases to be a public nuisance. And in fact, one talk that I went to when I was over there, there was some, apparently Parliament debated whether or not to declare this type of hedge a public nuisance, because they get very large and people don't maintain them. And the Chamaecyparis, let's see, it's actually a hybrid between our Northwest native, well, it used to be called Chamaecyparis nootkitensis. It has a different name now, and Cupressus macrocarpus. And they hybridized in a garden in England, actually, because we have the Chamaecyparis up here and the Cupressus macrocarpus is down in California. And so they never would meet normally, but then they were both growing as sort of specimen plants in a British garden, and they hybridized and formed this sort of Frankenstein hybrid that grows very, very vigorously and then kind of poops out, kind of peters out. Anyway, I could go on.
Wow, interesting. Huh?
Yeah.
So that, I guess the rest, everyone else is happily content. I just see no more questions. So
they're probably out in the kitchen whipping up some scones.
I think that's probably it, and or making tea. So
yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much, Sarah. That was a delightful journey, and I appreciate you being willing to speak to us.
Well, I'm only sorry that I couldn't be with you over in Wenatchee Valley, and perhaps sometime in the not too distant future once we all get our shots. So
right, I will remain hopeful for that moment. All right. Well, thank you everyone out there in Native Plant Enthusiasm Land for tuning in tonight. And spring is springing, so get out there and chase those flowers. And be ready for Native Plant Appreciation Month, because there's a lot of stuff coming at you.